Why most digital nomad YouTubers are untrustworthy is the topic of today's video. We're going to talk about why they're doing it, and then we're also going to talk about some of the most common problems and also most common gains that you can enjoy when living abroad. Everything has a reason, right? Things happen for a reason. And the reason why digital nomad YouTubers make things look a lot better than they actually are is because they want to sell you their residence and citizenship services, because that's how they make money. That's how they can justify being on this platform, because we're all doing it in order to secure financial gain. Very few people are just doing it because they feel like it. Most people have a financial interest in mind, and digital nomad YouTubers are no exception. So what I wanted to talk with you about are the most common reasons why this happens. So yes, residence and citizenship programs is definitely something that motivates a lot of digital nomad YouTubers to actually put content out there, because they can make huge money by just selling, one service, because those residence and citizenship programs, they sell for a lot of money, depending on where you get citizenship. If you get citizenship in the Caribbean, and let's say you pay $100,000 to a Caribbean government, then a digital nomad YouTuber can easily justify, charging you 20 to 50% of that just in fees, right? So that's going to be added on top of what you pay to the government. So pretty expensive process. And in my personal opinion, in order for you to get citizenship by investment or citizenship by donation, you don't really need to go for any YouTuber. You can do it on your own. And just because somebody tells you that they can do it and then make it sound a lot more difficult than it is, just so they can get money from you, doesn't mean that you cannot do it on your own. Digital nomad YouTubers, expat capitalist YouTubers make it sound like it's really difficult, because if they make you believe that it's really difficult and that you will fail, you're more likely to take them up on their service. And that's something that's been happening for a very long time right now. Expectation does not always meet reality. And what I mean by that is that if a YouTuber makes it sound like too good to be true, if something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. Meaning, if a person tells you like how great this place is because you can easily obtain a second passport, or you can easily obtain residency, and they're complaining about how bad a Western country is, and they're only talking about the negative aspects of a Western country and only talking about the positive aspects of a second world or developing country, then you know that you're dealing with a scammer, pretty much, a scam artist, because every place on this planet has pros and cons. And my mission on this channel is to talk about both for each place, because it's very unfair to just talk highly about developing countries. I mean, developing countries are great, because in developing countries you have a lot of benefits, and we will get to this at the end of the video, but it's not all sunshines and unicorns. You're gonna run into problems when living in developing countries, and it's not just all the good stuff. It's not always about the good stuff, it's about the bad stuff too. And it's really important for you to form an honest opinion, because if you believe that a place is just all about positives and not about negatives, you'll be shocked when you actually get there sooner rather than later. We're talking about a few weeks to a few months. Reality kicks in, and your exciting expectations didn't come to fruition, because when you live in a place, it's different than when you actually vacation, or it's different when you just listen to a YouTuber telling you how great the place is, because you haven't actually been there, you haven't actually experienced the whole spectrum of facets that you encounter when you're living in the place, that you just don't have the option to actually form that opinion in the first place. And there's obviously a big reason behind that. And one of the biggest reasons why digital nomad YouTubers, and some of them aren't even selling citizenship or residence services, the reason why they're doing that, why they're just talking about how great the place is and not how bad it is, even though there's a lot of bad stuff too, is because they're scared of getting kicked out of the country, which is more likely to happen in a developing country than it is in a Western country, because in Western countries we have freedom of speech. You can say whatever you want. But then when you hear a person talk about Serbia, for instance, or when you hear a person talk about Colombia, they're only going to talk about the good stuff because they have investments there, but the reality is very different. I mean, I'm not saying that Serbia is not a great country. Serbia has a lot to offer. It's a very exciting country, you know, if you want to achieve certain things, you know, if you want to potentially start a company and you want to obtain residency that way, I mean, it can be a fantastic place because you kill two birds with one stone. So I'm not saying it's not a great place. It is a great place, but it has some issues too, right? Just as any other place has. And they know if they were going critical on the government, it would certainly come back and bite them in the hiney, because second world and developing countries' governments, they aren't necessarily receptive to criticism as much as Western countries, even though we have seen a reduction in freedom of speech in certain Western countries. It still is more present than it is in developing countries and second world countries. What I recommend before you consider getting residence or citizenship in any country is for you to just go there and try it out, because what's the worst thing that can happen? You go there and you don't like it. Okay, that's fine. Then at least you have tried it, you've given it your best shot, and if it didn't work out, at least you know why it didn't work out. So instead of just worrying right now about, well, should I actually go ahead and pay the service, which you shouldn't do anyway because you'd rather do it yourself. If you really fail to do it, then you can consider hiring like a consultant to do it for you. But if you haven't even tried it yourself, and you know, if you're dealing with a consultant that charges like tens of thousands of dollars, which in my personal opinion is not justifiable because it's just a few hours of work anyway, so it's ridiculous to pay that much money for something that you can do on your own, or that you can, you know, potentially outsource to a different company that would charge a fraction of what an established YouTuber charges. And that's my humble opinion. It's how I go about it. It's how people that I know go about it, because at the end of the day, you can do it on your own. And again, if you fail to do it, then potentially you can look into it, because maybe there's language barrier, maybe you don't know the right people, but that's usually not the case, because you're dealing with the government and they're going to tell you if there are documents missing, they're going to tell you, you know, why your application was denied, and you know, you can work towards achieving the approval. Let's talk about the common gains that you have when living in a developing country, because I think that's very exciting, you know, and that inspired me, you know, during my time in Southeast Asia. Before I moved to Southeast Asia, what really got me fired up was the fact that I could live for a lot less than what I spent back home. And that was exciting because, you know, if you're a guy building his internet business, or if you're an established person who has already a decent income, if you are, let's say, a 5-figure or 6-figure a month earner, then what you want to achieve obviously is reducing your taxes. You want to cut your taxes. And that's one of the big pros, because in developing countries, as a rule of thumb, right, as a rule of thumb, you pay less in taxes than you pay in a westernized country. That's just how it is, for a number of reasons, right? The money does not go towards social security, the money doesn't go towards a pension, you know, the government isn't using the money to develop infrastructure. Potentially they are securing money through different means to make that happen, so they're charging their citizens a lot less. And a country, or countries, you know, just to name a few examples, are Bulgaria, Romania, where the income tax rate is 10%, right? It's flat. Whether you earn $50,000 a year or $2 million a year, you only ever pay 10% in taxes. And that's great, because again, you can save so much money. If you would have lived in, say, Spain, you know, or Germany, or, you know, Britain, or the US, you know, you would have paid a lot more in taxes than you would have in Bulgaria or Romania. So from that point of view, it's a fantastic investment to move to a developing country, because you can save a lot of money in taxes. The low cost of living is appealing because, you know, if you get more in a place where you potentially have a budget of $2,000 a month than a place where you used to spend $8,000 a month, then that's pretty impressive, you know, and that's what most people want. They want to get more bang for the buck. And if you move to a developing country, you actually achieve that, because anything that you want to consume in a developing country is, generally speaking, much cheaper than it is in a Western country. There are, of course, exceptions. Don't get me wrong. Exceptions obviously include imported goods and services. You know, like for instance, if you want to drive a BMW in Thailand, you're probably going to pay a lot more than it would cost you in Texas or in Austria, for instance, because there's going to be a higher tax rate placed on such an item being imported into the country. Also depends on the geographic location of the country, you know, depending on where you're located. You know, if the product had to come from a different continent, and you know, if there was a lot processes involved in order to get it imported, or if the government puts just high taxes on the product in general, then obviously you're going to pay a lot more than you would have paid in a different country. Some countries charge ridiculous amounts of taxes for imported cars. We're talking about developing countries here. Luxury cars are very expensive in certain developing countries because governments charge literally 50 to 150% taxes on such a car. So just having a regular car, an economic car, would be much more affordable, would be more intelligent if you want to save money, because it's just going to be cheaper. Services are going to be cheaper in developing countries because people get paid less by the hour. Employers don't pay healthcare. There's no pension system in place, and there's no minimum hourly rate in place, or generally the minimum hourly rate is much lower than it is in a developed country, that you can, for instance, go for a massage and only pay $7 or $10 an hour, which would cost you like $100 to $150 in a country like Switzerland or in Dubai. Another big pro is, of course, cheap labor. So if you have a business, or if you want to build a business and you want to do it in a developing country where you can pay less in taxes, where you can obtain cheap labor, then that is fantastic, because people from developing countries, their work ethic is oftentimes great because they have to prove themselves. That's one aspect of it. They want to improve themselves. They're looking up to the West. They're looking up to Western citizens because they know that Western countries are placed above theirs in terms of economic output, in terms of standard of living, in terms of respect. Western countries are just higher up there, so they have to prove themselves, if they want to work for a Western company or by a local company run by a Western individual, where they just know they have to put in a lot more work. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is why local citizens want to work for a foreign company is because they usually get paid more than if they would work for a local company run by someone local. Usually companies that are owned by Western people, we just offer more because we want those people to work for us for the mid to long term, depending on our business model. And of course, that's better for us because if your business has a much lower turnover, then that's much better for you long term, because you don't need to keep replacing people than if you had a very high turnover and you would need to continually be training people in order to maintain your business, which is not something that works anywhere on this planet. And that's really important. So cheap labor is fantastic in developing countries. You don't need to pay for insurance. You don't need to pay for Social Security or some kind of a pension plan, 401k. That doesn't exist there. It exists, certain companies are offering it, but most of the times it just doesn't exist in very developing countries, like we're talking Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa. It does exist in quite a few European countries, and don't get me wrong, it exists in Southeast Asian countries too. There are a lot of companies offering it, but it still isn't universal yet to the point where every person gets it. Now that we talked about the common gains, I also wanted to talk with you about the common problems that you experience when living in a developing country. And that's of course something that is always going to be present. And I just want to talk about this very briefly, okay? If you're moving from the West to a developing country, you're giving up something valuable. And we're talking about sometimes security, because life in Latin America is not as safe as it is in, for instance, Western Europe. There's less crime in Western Europe than there is in Latin America. Of course, it doesn't apply to every single place. Definitely applies to big cities. European cities are much safer than Latin cities. Just as a rule of thumb, that's the case, but it may still differ depending on the neighborhood. But generally speaking, like, you're less likely to run into crime in a developed Western city than in a Latin city. That's just as a rule of thumb. Now, does that mean you're going to have a lot of crime-related issues when you're living in the countryside? No, not at all. It doesn't mean like that. Or if you're living in a smaller city, also not. It depends, right? But generally speaking, there's more crime in developing countries because people are poorer. And if you move there as an established person, as a rich person, and you definitely have a bit of a target on your back, but it's something that you can, get your head around, because you can avoid going to certain places, you can avoid doing certain things. So I have quite a few friends that live in Latin America, and they just avoid going to bars because they don't want to get drugged, or they just avoid certain drinks. They only, drink if the bottle has been opened in front of their eyes, and that's just how it is. So crime exists everywhere. It exists in Southeast Asia, it exists in Europe, it exists in the United States, in Africa, in Latin America. It exists everywhere. Air pollution, we've been talking about this quite a bit on the channel in the past, and air pollution is definitely more present in the developing countries than it is in Western countries, because developing countries are less regulated. That again depends on where you're located. If you're located in a metropolitan, then you're going to have more issues in terms of pollution than if you were to live in like a smaller city. And that's definitely the case in developing countries. The right situation is another thing that Western people complain about a lot, because if you move to a developing country and you want to become a citizen or you want to own property, there's certain places where that is not a problem, where that is easy to do. In Latin America, a foreigner can own property, they can own land, they can become a citizen. You can actually have dual citizenship. So let's say you are from Britain, you are from France, you are from wherever, the United States, Canada, and you want to become a citizen of Ecuador, no problem. You don't need to give up your existing citizenship in order to obtain citizenship in Ecuador. Just an example, Southeast Asia, very different. It's more difficult to obtain citizenship there. And even if you could, a lot of countries don't allow dual citizenship. So you'd have to surrender your current Western citizenship in order to gain citizenship in a developing country. It's not something that every person is willing to do. Ideally, you want to have dual citizenship, I think. Internet reliability can be a problem. Generally speaking, the internet reliability has improved in certain developing countries. There's still some developing countries that are struggling a lot, and we're talking about remote islands. The Philippines is still struggling. Countries in the South Pacific are struggling with internet reliability. We're talking about New Caledonia. We're talking about, all these small islands in Micronesia, for instance, they're all struggling. So generally speaking, the internet on islands is much worse than it's going to be on the mainland. That's just how it is. And that also applies to certain Caribbean islands, to be perfectly honest with you. It even applies to more remote locations in developing countries. And by the way, the internet may also not be as reliable in the countryside if you live in a Western country. So one thing does not exclude the other, right? But I would say, as a rule of thumb, the internet in developing countries is usually a little bit worse, at least a little bit worse than it is in a developed country. What do you think about digital nomad YouTubers? Are they really untrustworthy? Are there any other topics you would like us to discuss in a future video? If so, leave a comment below and let us know. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. I'm uploading new videos on digital nomad locations, travel updates, and investment advice several times a week right now. And if you got some more time left, check out these videos.